Welcome to Tropic Topics. As we start out, we're looking at the activity ongoing in the Atlantic, and there's not much. You might be asking yourself, what's going on out there, and what have we had so far this season, and is this normal? Is this above average? Is it below average? How does it project out for the rest of the season? Well, if you're asking yourself those questions, you're in luck, because we're going to cover those exact topics today. We're going to talk about all of the things that you may need to know as we go through the rest of the hurricane season, as we wrap up early season activity. And early can be anything from very active to completely quiet, and it really doesn't have an impact on the overall numbers for the rest of the season. But we're off to at least a good start as far as potential impacts, especially for the U.S. and really anyone in general, because there hasn't been a whole lot of tropical activity out of the Atlantic basin impacting anything. We certainly have had tropical activity. We just haven't had it impact anything so far this season. So that's the good news. And as we look out there right now, the wave we've been watching for well over a week that the models just completely whiffed on, because they had this thing turning into even a major hurricane as it rounded the subtropical high. And now we're looking at just a 10% chance of development. Thanks for joining us. We are live in a bunch of different places, mypanhandle.com, Facebook, Instagram, as well as YouTube. So no matter where you're watching us from, we do thank you for that. And if you join at any point in time throughout the broadcast, certainly you can go back to the beginning and watch it after this is all said and done. It'll be on mypanhandle.com. The full scope of everything, as well as a summary, will be there as well. So those are the places to go if you've missed any information. But we're just starting out here. This should be a quick one because we don't have a whole lot to talk about overall, but there is at least some stuff. And I don't want anyone to let their guard down, because as we like to say, prepared, not scared around here. We certainly know that it only takes one storm to make an impact and really to make or break a season, regardless of how many numbers there are out there throughout the season overall. So far this year, we haven't seen a whole lot of activity, but what activity we have seen has been following basically our El Nino graphic as we do look on out. So what are the favored locations and favored tracks as we go throughout this season? Well, this is my projection, but based on other El Nino seasons, this does hold true. So typically, as we are going through El Nino seasons, what does El Nino mean? It means warmer than average equatorial waters on the eastern Pacific. That is what we monitor because it changes the overall weather pattern. Typically, you have cooler water in the eastern Pacific, and that puts warm water in the western Pacific, and that really influences the entire weather pattern around the globe. When you shift where the warmer water is, it shifts the entire weather pattern, which is why we track El Nino and La Nina, because it has a major impact not only on local weather here, but also worldwide. It changes the entire global pattern. So part of the reason why we've been seeing such a stubborn summer pattern has to do with El Nino developing and taking control of the overall weather scheme, as well as just the general fact that we have more heat in the atmosphere as well as moisture, and that's playing a big role, as well as just sensor issues, if I can talk correctly, as well. So there's a whole lot of reasons going into why has it been so hot, but the biggest player really is El Nino overall. As we look at the tracks here, the good news is if we get a big number of tropical systems develop as we go through peak season, and peak season is typically August 10th to October 10th, but some say the 20th to the 20th. Really, as you get to October 20th, you see the activity really drop off after that point in time. So that really is usually the beginning of the end of the season. So that's the date we all shoot for, is getting to around the 20th of October without incident. You get there and odds are you're going to be pretty okay through the rest of the hurricane season. But the fact with El Nino is that you get a lot of recurves because we have a stronger high pressure system in the Atlantic. And with that stronger high pressure system in the Atlantic, you get these things to curve around with troughing in general across the east. So where does the exception come in for the Gulf of Mexico? Well, typically, it's late season when we start to get cold fronts come in and settle across the Gulf of Mexico. That's usually when we see the activity perk up. For instance, most of us remember back to 95, and that was a El Nino season. It was also when we had Opal. And of course, Opal started in the Bay of Campeche, rode a cold front, and came all the way up into our area. So El Nino doesn't mean a complete shutout for the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, but it typically means a quieter season because you have a busier Eastern Pacific season, and that throws shear across the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, which is why the Atlantic and really the Atlantic main development region out into the subtropics is typically the more busy. So that puts an emphasis on the East Coast for potential impacts. But if you get slight shifts in this pattern, say the ridge overall broadens out, well, then for our area, we have to be concerned about crossover, stuff that runs through the peninsula, then hits a cold front and turns up into our area, or stuff that shoots the strait, goes through the Florida Straits, and then out into Louisiana and Texas, riding that ridge. That typically stuff that goes through the strait usually doesn't take that hard right-hand turn and come up. It usually just keeps on rolling because high pressure is usually in control in our area if it's flying through the strait. So that's also good news if you're here locally. If you're up and down the eastern seaboard, I would say this season is definitely the season to pay attention to because this is the type of season where we can get these surprise storms, especially storms that hit against a trough and then make that hard left-hand turn into the northeast. Sandy, ring a bell. Certainly that's the possibility here, which is why I do have the northeast highlighted. It hasn't had a major hurricane in quite some time, but it's not out of the normal for the Northeast to have a major hurricane. In fact, in the 60s, we had the Northeast get 4 major hurricane landfalls in the Northeast in that decade alone. So while it hasn't happened in a while for the Northeast, it's not out of the normal for them to have tropical systems and for them to have strong tropical systems. It just hasn't happened in a while. So luck might be running out across the Northeast, especially with the pattern favorable this year. That doesn't mean that the system will go there. It just means that the more likely possibility of East Coast runners type of systems that might recurve or possibly could catch that hook and pull back to the U.S. So the places that stick out, obviously the tip of the peninsula down toward Miami to the Space Coast, and then the Outer Banks going across the Carolinas, and then the Cape going up and the East Coast all the way into the Northeast. So those are the places I think that are at most risk as we go through peak season into the rest of the hurricane season. But overall, we're talking about favorable conditions in the Atlantic right now. That doesn't mean it'll stay that way forever. Typically, July is a quiet month where we don't see a whole lot of activity. But as we get into August, we start to see things pick up. Thankfully, the models aren't really indicating that at the moment. They're more or less highlighting not much to continue as we go through the rest of the next couple of weeks. So certainly good news on that front. Where have we been so far this year? Well, we've had 5 storms. I know you only see 4 here, but that's because the first storm of the season actually happened in January. It was not named, and it was after the fact that they said, nope, that was actually tropical, and they gave it an unnamed designation. So that was technically our first storm of the season, and it goes as unnamed. If you remember back, we had Arlene in the Gulf of Mexico. It was that odd one that dove south and dissipated before reaching Cuba. We've also had the strongest system and one of the longest long track systems, Dawn, which was our last one that developed north into the subtropics, did a nice little loop for us, and then became a hurricane north of 40 degrees latitude, which is not normal, but the subtropics are quite warm and more than capable of supporting tropical activity with how warm they are. And then we had Cindy and Brett that they started and they died. So that takes me to my next point that much of what you have heard and hype you've heard so far for the season, even in spite of El Nino, we're going to have an active season because the waters are so warm, right? Well, the waters are warm, but warm waters don't actually create tropical activity. You need a storm for that to happen. Warm waters just serve as fuel. So if you don't have a storm, then the fuel doesn't matter. It's kind of like if you have a gas can full of gas sitting in your garage. Is there potential for it to explode and catch on fire? Sure. But you need an ignition source for that to happen. Same kind of thing for tropical activity. The warm waters just serve as fuel once you have a storm. If you don't have a whole lot of storm activity out there, then they can't take advantage of that. And if the upper levels of the atmosphere aren't right for activity to continue to develop, well, then it can't take that resource that's there available and use it. So warm waters is really not the end-all be-all. It is the state of the atmosphere that is more important for genesis of tropical activity. And then once you have that, then the waters become important. So that's why you're hearing all this information, because if we do get storms to start to develop and we have a better environment in the atmosphere for this to happen, then there's certainly plenty of fuel for them to take advantage of. And that potentially could mean stronger tropical systems. It doesn't always mean that, but it certainly could, because there is that potential there. There's a whole lot of things that go into the factor of strengthening, but warmer waters does indicate a higher probability of rapid intensification as well as stronger storms. But again, the environment and the atmosphere matter equally, if not more so, than how warm the water is. Warm waters don't make storms, they just fuel storms. So all that hoopla and hype you've heard only matters once you start to get storms. And as we can see, the atmosphere hasn't been all that conducive, and even the storms that have gotten going just haven't been able to maintain because we've had dry air and shear. Not unusual for the beginning of our tropical season for July and even going into August to not see that much in the way of tropical activity. One of the main reasons for that, lots of dry air. And yeah, you can see the Saharan dust hanging around the lower 48 as well. And check out the plumes that just keep coming off of Africa. That's a lot of dust out there. With all of that dust, it makes it really hard for tropical activity to not only get started, but also sustain. We've talked about it quite a bit here the last couple of days in our forecast locally, because the dry air really doesn't hang out at the surface, and dust doesn't really hang out at the surface either. It can, but it gets caught up in the winds, and the winds in the upper levels as well as the mid levels. And so what happens is moisture goes up, it hits that dry air layer, and then it collapses back down to the surface, and it basically just chokes off this convection that's trying to take advantage of the warm fuel that's out there, but just can't do so because every time it hits that drier layer, it's got to eat through it to be able to continue and sustain. And you can see there's a ton of dry air out there. So as long as that's staying around, you're definitely going to see tropical activity suppressed. Where is the tropical activity not going to be suppressed? Well, where the dry air isn't. So note the troughing up and down the East Coast, and you see that there's not a whole lot of Saharan dust up and down the East Coast on the Atlantic side. That's why I think the main development area that could be actually on those troughs right off of the East Coast, which again also plays into that factor where we could see that issue up and down the eastern seaboard. So where are we in tropical activity and where are we headed? Well, August 1st being yesterday, we are just going into what we call peak season because 90% of all activity happens between August 20th and October 20th, and you can see the curve there highlighting that quite nicely. That's where the majority of our storms happen. It's where the majority of the names happen. It's where the majority of the landfalls happen. And then you can see the second peak there around October 20th, and then the absolute fall off from that point forward. And you might ask, why do we have so much fall off? Well, that's because cold fronts start coming down. So once you start getting the cold fronts to get into the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, then you're increasing the shear. So while you may have less dry air out there toward the end of the season, you definitely have more wind shear. And wind shear is equally devastating in the atmosphere for tropical activity. They want calm conditions, clear conditions, and lots of moisture. So you want high pressure with no dry air embedded in that high pressure system. And highs and dry air kind of go hand in hand. So you get where the issues come in. You're trying to find these pockets that can develop. And it's certainly possible. Even in unfavorable environments, you can get stuff to go. So overall, as we look at the tropical activity out there, I want to highlight a couple of things because we do a tropical analysis all the time and you might be confused. I like to use wind vectors or streamlines. What you see here on the map is showing you what our overall wind looks like. And this says Euro model at the top, but this is actually the GFS because I switched it. So ignore the label at the top. That's false advertising. This is actually the American model, the GFS, the Global Forecasting System, as we call it. With the red arrows highlighting the counterclockwise rotation, that is what we refer to as positive vorticity or cyclonic vorticity. That is where our low pressure systems develop. The blue arrows and the clockwise circulation, that is anti-cyclonic or high pressure systems, anticyclonic because it is obviously the opposite of cyclonic vorticity. So I've highlighted a couple of different areas, and you can see what we refer to as the subtropical high there in the big blue arrows that are circulating clockwise. And just why is this important? Well, that big subtropical high, as it breaks down, it produces areas of positive vorticity and it suppresses areas of low pressure. I know I've just gone way over your head here, but what we're talking about is that high pressure system dominating the Atlantic causes sinking air and disrupts the ability for these things to try to develop. And I gave you a good example of this. As we go through the next couple of days, you can see the big subtropical high suppressing an area of low pressure that's going to come off of Africa, what we refer to as our tropical waves. And it tries to get going, and it looks like it's got a decently favorable environment. Keep in mind all the Saharan dust that's already out there and what's going to be coming off. We just showed you that. So that Saharan dust is going to be playing a big role in this as well. But watch the subtropical high here just absolutely attack that area of low pressure, washes it out, and turns it basically into just a tropical trough. That's where you get that little bulge there. That's usually an area of disturbed weather, but that's certainly no longer cyclonic vorticity because it's stretched out. So it's much harder for something to develop once it gets stretched out like that and has to be dealing with all of that dry air. And you can just see how that subtropical, as we get later into the season, we're likely going to start to see more Eastern Pacific activity, which means the Caribbean is going to have a lot of shear to deal with. So is the Gulf of Mexico. And you're going to continue to see these wave breaking events where these high pressure systems basically just rip apart these low pressures that are trying to develop. So more or less what we're going to be watching is going to be those troughs, those cold fronts that make it on the eastern seaboard, see if they can spin, and then see if these high pressure ridges can kind of block that moisture back into the U.S. Think Ivan after it made landfall. It did that loop around the subtropical high, came back across Florida, but instead of going up through the Gulf of Mexico first, I'm talking about just non-tropical entities rotating around that subtropical high and then potentially trying to get slingshot back into the U.S. So in my mind, that's probably where we're going to see the most interest is probably there on the Atlantic side of the peninsula of Florida and then running up the eastern seaboard. That's going to be the area to watch for potential development as we head into the peak season because main development region looks like it's going to continue to get suppressed by El Nino, dry air, and these wave-breaking events. And eventually, we'll likely see just what we refer to as a tropical upper tropospheric trough, or TUT, develop across the Atlantic that is typical as we head into late El Nino seasons. You usually get a big suppressive high-pressure system to set up with that TUT, and that's it. That just kills your tropical activity. So for us here in the Gulf of Mexico, it's likely late season activity is something to watch. And if we can get one of these waves to kind of run underneath this subtropical ridge and then make it to the Gulf of Mexico with some kind of vorticity in it, then we could see something try to continue to spin. But overall, sheer dry air are the biggest issues for the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico this year, which is why El Nino seasons are typically quiet seasons for the Gulf as well as the Caribbean. I really don't see that being any reason for that to change, but like I said, prepared, not scared. Always want to be ready for that one system just in case it does happen. Keep in mind, 95, El Nino season, that was Opal. There was only one hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico that year, and it was Opal. So it really only does take one storm to get in there. Even if you average down the number of storms and you have less opportunity, you still got to be prepared for that one storm. So while I'm still sticking, I haven't changed my forecast. I'm still sticking with 10 to 13 total storms, which is way under what all the other predictions are out there. Most of them are predicting at least a normal season, 14 storms or above, 14 to 18 storms. I don't see that happening. If we're going to get to 18 storms, we would need 14 more storms from now through the end of the season. And with the models not showing really of any interest over the next 2 weeks, that means we may not be talking about tropical activity picking up until maybe the 13th or 14th of August. And I just don't think we're going to have enough time because I think El Nino eventually is going to grab hold of the Atlantic and the weather pattern in the Atlantic, and that's just going to really cut off the season early. So I think the season's on borrowed time, and I think the season probably ends on the early side because we'll likely see fall come in a little bit earlier than we typically do. Keep in mind, our falls are hot. We don't have cold falls. So when I say falls, I just mean drier air actually making it to us, not that we're going to see massive cool downs in October. That's not going to happen. You're still in Florida. You're still in the panhandle of Florida. So no, we're not going to see anything like that. But I do think that cold fronts will actually start to make it to us and move through us as we go through the month of October, which should put an early end to the season in the Gulf of Mexico. So hopefully things do play out that way. That's the way I've seen it all this year so far, and that's the way I still see it. So I haven't changed my opinion on the overall tropical season, even though the water is extremely warm. I think the suppressive nature of the Atlantic so far this year, as well as El Nino probably putting an end to the season early, likely cuts down on the number of possible opportunities for tropical systems. So we'll see how it plays out, but I am optimistic overall that things are going to continue to look good. But as always, we'll keep you updated, and keep in mind that we are doing tropic topics this year like we did last year as needed. So we're not coming here routinely, but we wanted to give you an update as we wrapped out of early season because we haven't had anything even remotely threatening the lower 48. So we haven't had any need to jump on and do a Tropic Topics, but we'll continue to do it that way. And so stay tuned and keep updated on social media as well as mypanhandle.com for the latest on the tropics. And make sure you can always check out the weather tab there. If you haven't been to our website and checked out the whole weather section, we have a lot of great resources. We have rip current information. We have a tropical page. We have maps that are dedicated to your local weather. We have county by county weather forecasts. I get questions asked all the time. Well, what about this location? You don't need to ask that. You can go to mypanhandle.com, go to the county by county section, look at your county, and it even breaks down all of the counties that are coastal into coastal and inland. So you'll know what the inland forecast is and what the coastal forecast is as well. And if you don't have the Storm Track 13 app, download that now. It is super handy during the summer because we all know you get the pop-up thunderstorms in the afternoon, and this will give you lightning notifications before you hear thunder. It happens to me all the time. I'll get a lightning notification through the Storm Track 13 app. It'll say lightning is near Callaway or lightning is near Panama City. And I'm like, what lightning? And I pull up the radar. Sure enough, there's a thunderstorm. It's about 15 miles away. And I'm like, yep. Well, that was pretty good. So that happens to me all the time, is that I get those notifications, and then that notification actually spurs me to look at the radar and see where the storms are. So I have, I think, 17 different locations saved in my Storm Track 13 app, and that highlights the entire area. It lets me know when it's storming anywhere across the area so I can be prepared to see what's going on and potentially have to communicate that if necessary. But if you have the Storm Track 13 app, you won't need to wait for my communication because you'll already be getting that notification in the palm of your hand. So make sure you download that, turn on your location services. We're not looking at your locations. We don't care where you are, but we certainly do care about you. So we want you to get those notifications about severe thunderstorms, tornado warnings, and of course those lightning notifications as well. Those are great things to have. I know it's a corporate pitch, and it is a corporate pitch because corporate wants us to want you to download it. But it's a good app, and we've put in a lot of work to make it an even better app. So I use it. I joke about that all the time, but I really do use it all the time. That along with Radar Scope, I use both of those apps probably as frequently as anything else. And those are really the only two weather apps I have on my phone. So there you go. That's really all you need. As we'll wrap up this episode of Tropic Topics, again, make sure to keep up with the latest on the tropical season through just watching the weather on the 5, 6, and 10, as well as on our social medias. Kristen, Jared, and I's. We all keep you updated on whatever's going on, and we'll be communicating as necessary whatever is going on as well. So those are the greatest things to do, is just keep up. If you just pay attention, you'll be prepared, you'll be ready to go.